Close behind them, reaching the shoreline, was the 1st Platoon under 2nd Lieutenant John J. Smith. Once on land, the Marines fanned out and headed for their target, the native village of Haleta, not far from the landing zone and a suspected enemy post. But Haleta was deserted. Company B combed the area for the Japanese, and finding none, they regrouped and waited for further orders. Everything was new to them. Unfortunately, know-how would come with deadly on-the-job training, and all the Marines of the 2nd Division thus became known as second to none. What they did not know, however, was that the islands they hit essentially were like preheated ovens, ready for action. Both landings that day were made to protect the left flank of the Tulagi landing force. The total casualties for D-Day on Florida Island were no enemy dead, 2 Leathernecks wounded, and 1 killed. As dawn broke that day, the fire support for the landings on Tulagi and Gavutu began to maneuver on various courses to bombard the predetermined targets. At 0610, the 1st Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers hit Tulagi Island. When the bombing started, the Riku Sentai scattered and headed for the caves and air raid shelters. At 0700, the landing craft transporting the 1st Marine Raider Battalion bound for Tulagi were sighted east toward the line of departure. The Hovey, DMs 11, Hopkins, DMs 13, and Trevor, DMs 16, executed a simultaneous turn to close with their targets. As they did so, the Mitsuwa anti-aircraft unit under Spell Lieutenant J.G. Toshichi Mitsuwa on Gavutu Hill opened fire at about 4,000 yards, the maximum range of the island guns. The Hopkins immediately returned fire. The guns of the Mitsuwa unit found the range of the Hopkins and fired several times without scoring any hits. There were close calls, but the Japanese shells were of a small caliber and their light charges inflicted no damage. However, the Hopkins, firing at the beach line on Gavutu, managed to put several rounds on top of Gavutu Hill 148, where the Mitsuwa anti-aircraft unit held the commanding position. At 0730, the San Juan, CL-54, began a bombardment and sent 100 rounds in the vicinity of Tulagi's southwest coast. In the meantime, 2 Guardians, the Monessen, DD-436, and Buchanan, DD-484, moved into position to provide additional Tulagi pounding with 5 minutes of shelling, while the Raider Battalion's landing craft were within 2,500 yards of the island's beach blue. The 2 destroyers also fired an additional 200 rounds each at the landing site on the south side of Tulagi. Some were wild shots. The shell holes can still be seen on the side of the island where the U.S. Navy peppered the solid rock. The San Juan poured 565-inch rounds from mounts 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 7 at Tulagi's Hill, 208, starting at 0743 and completed by 0759. But the bombardment was a washout. The Japanese sea infantry on Tulagi were safe. Not one was killed. At 0804, a spotter on the San Juan informed Lieutenant Cedar Matt Radom that a submarine periscope had been sighted at a distance of 1,500 yards. Alarm bells rang as Radom bumped the speed up to 25 knots and went after the sub at 0809, dropping 6 depth charges. No other sighting was reported. Meanwhile, at 0830, the Trevor scored 1 hit near the Gavutu gun emplacement, momentarily disrupting the action. But Mitsuwa's gunners were soon back at work. To help reduce Gavutu's strongpoint, the command center on the carriers dispatched SBDs, which dropped loads near the battery, but only damaged a nearby building. Like Tulagi Island, Gavutu was full of limestone caves that were safe havens during the bombing. At H-hour 0800, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion put Plan T into effect, the operational concept for the invasion of Tulagi, codenamed Figure 16. At H-hour 0800, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion put Plan T into effect, the operational concept for the invasion of Tulagi, codenamed Ringbolt. The mission was led by Colonel Merritt A. Edson and reinforced by the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, 2/5, and E Battery, 11th Marines, E11. Edson's staff had expected it to be a cookie party. It will be the type of quick operation for which we had trained. We would hit hard, capture the island, and be back on the ships in a day or so. The Japanese on Tulagi, they called it Tsuragi, had other plans. Edson's raiders had been divided. 104 aboard the Neville, AP-6, 110 on the Haywood, and the balance 604 men on the 4 ships of Transport Division 12, the Colquhoun, Gregory, Little, and McKean. As soon as the raiders were settled in the swaying landing craft, LCPs, more popularly called Higgins boats, they headed for Tulagi's Beach Blue on the southwest coast of the island. The Little acted as the control ship, with the McKean, Gregory, and Colquhoun providing fire support. However, not one landing craft of the first wave was able to set its occupants on the shore. They had to wade in. They were led by Baker B Company, followed by Dog D Company. The raiders had some difficulty reaching Beach Blue, the designated landing area. Major Justice Jumping Joe Chambers, who commanded Company D, reported, "It was the last place that the Japanese thought we would land. It was completely surrounded by coral reefs, and this made it necessary to halt the boats on the edge of the reef. Then everybody had to plunge into the water and wade to shore." Tom Pollard, a mortarman, remembers jumping over the side 100 yards from shore and sinking into a pothole before someone pulled him up. This was no fun, as they had discovered during training in Samoa, because coral reefs are dotted with holes, and at any moment they were likely to step into water that was over their heads. The best beach on Tulagi was at the other end of the island, and the Japanese had clearly expected any hostile landing would be made there. Consequently, they had very lightly fortified the beach where the Marines landed. Despite these difficulties, the raiders landed exactly on schedule at 0800 H-hour. They were forced to wade, some neck-deep, in the foaming surf, while the 2 landing craft were hung up on the coral outcrops that partially surrounded the island. The Japanese had faced the same problem 3 months earlier. Not knowing the depth of the water certainly presented a problem. Only when the first raider landed with his head above water and stumbled forward to the sharp-edged beach did the others swarm over the gunwales. Able, A, Company was next, followed by Charlie, C Company in the second wave. They were fortunate, as the Curé Third had not set up barbed wire or installed Type 98 hemispherical anti-boat mines. It was also fortunate that the marine height qualification was a minimum of 5 feet 6 inches, or else many would have drowned pushing against the turbulent waters with more than 70 pounds of gear. Some nevertheless did. Company D, the weapons company with 60mm mortars, led by Captain George W. Herring, was responsible for beachhead security. Meanwhile, A and C companies were stuck on the coral outcrops, though the lead element by 0830 had reached the crest of a very steep hill and ended up in the Tulagi Cemetery. The target, Tulagi, was a steep island measuring 5.7 miles in circumference. Its largest ridge on the rugged interior rose 347 feet near the northwest sector, sloping down to 300 feet. The uneven island levels off near the government residency, with a few houses nearby. The island is shaped somewhat like an hourglass, with hills, ravines and jungles, but it also had a former developed government area at the southeastern end, complete with a cricket field, tennis court and golf links. While at Noumea, Lieutenant Henry E. Jocelyn, RANV, the former assistant district officer on Guadalcanal, had constructed a plaster cast of Tulagi, complete with moulded terrain landscape. Jocelyn also had been a district officer on Tulagi and knew it well. The detail of his casting was so fine that, after having observed it before their invasion, some of the Marines would later say, "It was like I had been there before D-Day." The present occupants of Tulagi were not friendly, however, nor were the former government grounds a pretty sight, now smashed and full of shell holes, complements of the U.S. Navy. At 0834 on the morning of August 7th, the San Juan was back in the business of lobbing shells at Tulagi. This time it targeted the prison far from the advancing raiders. She fired 280 rounds. Subsequently, 20 minutes later, she began firing at Tanambogo Island, and within a span of 6 minutes fired 410 rounds. At 1004, she launched 280 rounds at Gavutu, but on board she ran into trouble. A power charge had exploded, killing 7 and wounding 11. Raider Pursuit August R. Montgomery was a member of the first wave that landed on Tulagi. According to orders, they immediately pushed inland to the depths of the jungle. The raiders pressed on through thick vegetation to the narrow midsection, the crown of the island, briefly harassed by snipers. Meanwhile, Company B pushed forward to the opposite coast, where it occupied the small boat-building village of Sasapi. Beach Blue sector was not the ideal place to land, Lieutenant Dick Horton, RANV, noted. He had been on Tulagi 4 months before the landing and was at the time tutoring Colonel Edson and his not-so-jolly raiders about the little-known island. Tulagi was passable, but it promised to be troublesome, and it was hot as hell. Horton had come ashore this time with the 3rd landing wave, which had brought the command unit. He recalls wading toward Beach Blue next to Colonel Edson and suddenly stumbling into one of the many coral potholes, losing his balance, while the ice-eyed Edson ploughed on ahead. Once ashore, Horton joined Lieutenant John Tiger Erskine, the Japanese language officer. The raiders were relieved to have arrived unnoticed on hostile shores. Thus they regrouped and climbed the steep slope, reaching the local cemetery and easily occupying the western sector. Colonel Edson was cautious but not slow, following an old military adage to go slow, then move out. At 11:20 he reported to Brig General William H. Rupertus, the assistant division commander still on the Neville in Tulagi Harbour, that he held Line A, which extended from the high ground northwest of Hill 281, Bird Hill, to Carpenter's Wharf, belonging to W.R. Carpenter and Company Limited, a South Sea Island trading company. Edson would attack from that position with a green rocket signal at 11:30. Earlier, at 0916, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, the backup support force for the raiders, had landed on Beach Blue. Raider reinforcements consisted of Combat Team 2, Combat Group A, 2/5, plus E Battery, 11th Marines, the first of the cannon cockers to land in the Solomons. They comprised 1,085 Marine officers and men from the Neville, APA 9, plus the rear echelon of Edson's raiders who had joined the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines on July 29th at the close of the rehearsal landings at Koro Island, Fiji Islands. At 0932, 2/5's command post was set up just west of the cemetery. There were no enemy defenders to greet them, and thus Company F moved into the northwest portion of the island. Company E headed for the high ground overlooking Sasapi. At 11:09, 2/5 reported that the northwest end of Tulagi had been cleared of enemy forces. The enemy reality. Robert Caulfield, at the time a private first class with Company F, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, recalls the Tulagi experience. Truthfully speaking, I didn't realize that we were in a real fight until we started to land. CPL Theodore F. Himmelsbach and I reached the beach about the same time. We saw Marines floating in the water that had drowned while landing, potholes. Then I knew we were in for a real fight. You are not scared until you actually see it. When things quieted down a bit, we started to take a break. We were sitting around, not too far from a house with a tin roof. Some guys were smoking, and all of a sudden a shot rang out from the roof. No one was hit, but we saw the Japanese jump off the roof and everybody fired at him. As machine gunners, our sidearms were not .45s, but 03s. But we smashed the SOB. I don't know who hit him. I suppose it was everyone. He must have had a dozen slugs in him, maybe more. Second Lieutenant Carroll, our platoon leader, stressed that our mission was to reinforce the raiders and to provide security to prevent any enemy landings. As a result, our gun teams were spread along the coastline. Every once in a while, someone would try to land, either by swimming or by barge, whatever they call those things, and we would plaster them with .50s until there was nothing left. A motion picture photographer, PFC Richard K. Hantz of the Division Intelligence Section, D2, landed with the 5th Marines. but other duties took precedence over his camera work. As a result, no film record was made of the events on Tulagi. It was a significant loss for historians. At 1000, Company E 2/5 arrived at the high ground overlooking Sasapi. There, it rendezvoused with Raider Company B, moving along the North Shore Trail. Company E reported that the Japanese had evacuated Sasapi. The evidence suggested a quick departure. By 1100, the 1st Platoon, Company H 2/5, Weapons Company, moved in the direction of Hill 203 and Phase Line A. This provoked enemy fire, and the platoon retaliated at the defenders. The 2/5 had its own secret one-man army, or rather a one-man force, Sergeant Lou Diamond from Bedford, Ohio. The bearded, legendary 52-year-old Diamond was rough, and it was said his voice was so strong that if he yelled, he was nicknamed the Honker, the Japanese would run, almost. His ability with mortars was so accurate, and his senses so keen, that it was said if an enemy soldier hiccuped, Lou could drop a mortar shell right down his throat. At 11:35, Company D of the Raiders reached Phase Line A in the island's centre. Then, relaying orders, they fired a cluster of green shells to notify the ships to bombard the eastern and more populous end of the island. The raiders now found the going extremely difficult at Tulagi's eastern end. Company C lost 2 men in the early minutes of combat when Peets, Leonard A. Butts and Lewis A. Lovin were hit. They were on the reverse slope of the ridge adjacent to Line A and were part of the skirmish line. They moved to the crest of the ridge and then faced a slope that was void of bush or vegetation. They hurried down the slope and on reaching the base were sprayed by machine gun fire. Butts died on the spot. Lovin was evacuated but later died aboard the Neville. At 1600, both Able and Charlie companies, Able under Captain Lewis Silent Lou Walt and Charlie under Major Ken Bailey, called Ken Dill, had reached their initial objectives. At 1625, Charlie Company encountered stiff resistance in the area of Hill 281, yet the advance continued until dark. Handfuls of the Kure 3rd Sea Infantry were well dug in, protecting the hill, and were determined to stop the invaders at any cost. The air and ship bombardment had killed only a small number of the island labourers and none of the Kure 3rd men, who had quickly sought shelter after the first shell had landed. Diarist S.M. Tomisaburo Hirai would write, "During the air raids, our commander, Esper Lieutenant J.G. Kikichi Yoshimoto, would be the first one in the shelter. He would often tell us to always be brave, but he is the one who is not brave." The Kura 3rd had dozens of long-tunnelled caves dug deep into the island's limestone cliffs, and the U.S. Navy was using the wrong type of ammunition against the rock formations. When the Marines entered the area, the Japanese emerged unharmed from the caves and octopus holes to fight furiously from machine gun and sniper positions. They demonstrated their philosophy of sacrifice, behaving in a way that baffled the attackers, who could not fathom such self-destruction. The Americans had shouted in English to the hole-bound termites to surrender, and a few who had picked up a smattering of Japanese yelled, "Buki wo wawase, kusan-se," surrender, self and troops, assuming that some could understand the Americanization of their language. However, not one of the enlisted sailors of the Kura 3rd SNLF could comprehend a word of English, though some of the officers could. Cornered and forced back into the caves, some of the Japanese escaped through other openings. Those refusing to surrender were killed by grenades or Molotov cocktails, or were shot when they ventured out. Most were labourers. Some had the ill-conceived notion that they were descendants of ancient warriors. Although the Marines were able to move forward at a reasonable pace, they repeatedly found it necessary to retrace their steps to hunt down the snipers. At 12:46, that midday of the 7th of August, the San Juan was called back for bombardment service on Tulagi's Hill 281. By 12:50, she had tossed 280 rounds of 5-inch shells at the problem knoll. At about 1300, First Lieutenant Rex Crockett's platoon of B Company ran into a group of frightened islanders near Carpenter's Wharf. The platoon shepherded the islanders to the rear, but what Lieutenant Crockett did not know was that the group was George Bogesi and his family. George was a native medical practitioner who had been living amidst the Japanese on Tulagi by permission, the only family to do so, because he was the garrison's contact with the natives on Florida and Savo Islands. Borghese had first met the Japanese on Tulagi when he had gone there to demand payment for his services as a native doctor to some wounded Japanese seamen that had washed on the shore of Savo Island after their vessel had been sunk. George was considered a turncoat, and his word was not trusted. Major Justice Chambers of Company D recalled those first days on Tulagi. Every building that we met had its quota of Japanese, and we had to drive them out or kill them with hand grenades. We had thought that coconut trees would not have enough branches to conceal snipers, but we found that the Japanese were small enough to hide in them easily, and so we had to examine every tree before we went by. If they had been good shots, few of us would have survived, but happily there was no comparison in marksmanship between the Marines and Japanese. Chambers was wounded when he was too near a mortar firing position as a round hit a tree and splattered. Captain William E. Spurling then took command of Chambers's Company D. Pursuit. Edward G. Sexton, the still photographer assigned to the raiders, was shot at several times. The Japanese had been only about 75 yards from me. They couldn't hit a bull in the arse with a board if it were sitting on its back. One raider had an opposite view. These guys were as tough as nails. Their snipers were very good. First Lieutenant Eugene Tex Key, commander of the 1st Platoon, Company B, was in a forward position when one of his men was hit by a sniper. No sooner had the Marine hit the ground when Key was also shot. Lieutenant J.G. Samuel Miles, one of the doctors, saw Key fall and rushed to his side. The Sun Devil sniper took their lives. W.O. Tsuneto Sakado's platoon had several snipers. From his 2nd squad were S.R. Haruo Okamoto, from his 3rd squad S.A. Takeo Sumi, from his 4th squad S.R. Katsuyoshi Ikeda, and from his 5th squad S.M. Shuichi Fuchikawa. Snipers from W.O. Sadayuki Kato's platoon included P.O.3 C. Roisuke Kuwabara, S.A. Yoshimi Hamaoka, S.A. Tadao Hironaka, and S.R. Yoshihiro Taniguchi. Half of W.O. Yoshiharu Muranaka's platoon was on Malaita Island on garrison duty. He had no sharpshooters. W.O. Noburo Obara had 4 shooters in his platoon. P.O.3C Torao Morishige, S.A. Tomehachi Ito, S.A. Shigeo Kawamura, and S.R. Mitsuo Nakajima. Most of the Kure men were reservists with an average age of 40, and included a small number who had served in the Great War. A few recruits were added in February of 1942 to fill out the Rikuzentai's full complement. Most of the Japanese snipers, however, had not fired much since basic training and were afraid to waste the ammunition. On board ship, they had conducted dry firing. Nevertheless, they made a dent in the Marines' advance. They used smokeless powder and could fire from the bush, remaining almost undetected. What the Marines did not know was that the 3rd Company of the Kure 3rd SNLF was the machine gun unit of the force. Meanwhile, at Hill 208, Company C raiders were held up for an hour by enemy machine guns, which were finally reduced with small arms fire and grenades. The Japanese were far from being a spent force, however, and Companies A and C moved on to the hill west of the cricket grounds. Major Kenneth D. Bailey, the CO of Raider Company C and a gifted leader, was wounded. Captain Robert H. Thomas then took command. So vigorous was the enemy's resistance that only one platoon of Company C could continue, but it managed to edge along the southern shore to the eastern tip of the island. Colonel Edson's biographer describes some of the Tulagi struggle. As usual, communications broke down just when they were most needed. Edson could not get a report from Walt's A Company, so he decided to go there himself and get a first-hand look at the situation. He called for Lieutenant John B. Sweeney, codenamed John Wolfe, who was in charge of CP, Command Post, Hill 301 Security, and the two set out for the right flank. They moved along Company B's lines for a short time and got challenged every few steps by alert, nervous Marines. No one knew where Captain Lewis Walt's CP was located. Walt's CP was 20 yards behind the company lines, but the captain was somewhere in the Hells Islands boondocks with the first sergeant and did not show up until the next morning. However, his executive officer, XO, First Lieutenant John W. Antonelli, was there, as was Second Lieutenant Thomas P. Mullahy. It became clear to Sweeney that the odds of reaching their objective were not good. After a brief halt and a reassessment, Red Mike decided to head back to his headquarters. The snipers of W.O. Sadayuki Kato's 2nd Platoon harassed the Marines as they tried to converge on the main position between the cricket grounds and Hill 281. PO-1C Nakasuke Miyagi and his squad of 9, with sharpshooter PO-3C Ryosuke Kuwabara, supported by PO-3C Harubumi Ishida and his 7 men with sniper SM Yoshimi Hamaota, were able to block the Marine advance. Supporting the Rikusentai were members of the 14th CU detachment led by PO-1C Hiroshi Furuichi, but they were not combat trained. They were electricians and engineers and had been busy on construction projects on Tulagi, Gavutu and Tanambogo, so the Kure 3rd had to assist in repelling the invaders. The 14th CU had completed work on wireless stations and was awaiting transportation back to Rabaul when the Marines landed. As the events proceeded, Company G, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, was moving toward the southeast part of the island along the well-worn ridge trail. Company E was having trouble in Chinatown, with snipers picking off Marines as they ventured away from protected areas. A concealed machine gun nest opened fire on Company G, and 5 Marines fell. The mortar platoon, 2/5, the Honker's own Sergeant Diamond, moved forward by 1345 and established a firing position. At 1400, the battalion command post was moved forward to the former Solomon Islands Constabulary Barracks and then later moved to the Residency, by then almost in ruins. It had been the home and office of 49-year-old Masaki Suzuki, who became island commander on July 15th, and once was the most beautiful residence in the Solomons when it had been surrounded by green moss and beautiful bougainvillea. As the battle wore on, Colonel Edson was growing concerned at the chaotic conditions and for a time considered calling for reinforcements, except that communications were then non-existent. Although they had expected the Japanese counterattack, the ferocity and determination of the assaults had surprised Red Mike and his XO. At one point, the enemy fought to within 50 yards of the Residency. Edson later called this threat to his command post one of his few exciting moments in the Guadalcanal campaign. The outnumbered handful of die-hard Kure 3rd warriors gave a solid account of themselves and taught the Marines a few new tricks. Raider Captain Robert P. Newfer of Company D heard an unusual command in an American manner near his position. "Come on, get your stuff together, we're pulling out of here." A Marine sergeant started to obey what sounded like an order, but almost as he got to his feet, someone else recognized that it was not a Marine at all who had spoken, but an enemy. The English-speaking Japanese officer, one of the 9, and 6 others hovering nearby were shot. "That trick indicated just how tough Tojo is," Newfer said. "It took guts." At 1800, the early evening of that first day of the invasion, Company B of the Raiders established itself for the night adjacent to the government wharf to the north and placed guards, while Companies A and C protected the right flank to the south. Edson's weapons company was in support along the ridge to the west. According to St. Pete G. Sparatino, a little behind Line A Company A, in the front of Company C, was CPL, Frank J. Guidoni's squad that set up a defense position facing up the slope to the crest of the ridge. There were ridges and hills all over Tulagi. He was actually on the reverse slope and expected the enemy to sneak over the ridgeline to attack. Guidoni told his men not to move ahead or back unless he ordered to do so. Somehow a fire was started in a building on a ridge in front of Guidoni's position, and this provided a clear picture. Anyone moving over the ridge would be silhouetted. The CP was about 20 yards to the rear, and Guidoni, taking advantage of the moment, needed more grenades. He went back to the CP and obtained a case. Not too long after that, full darkness set in. There was a movement to the front. You could hear them jabbering. Then the enemy found a gap and began running through the opening. The gap was sealed when another squad closed the gate. Some Japanese had crawled within 20 yards of Guidone's squad. Frank began throwing grenades from a prone position. His grenades were going off 15 yards from our position, and we had to duck as they exploded. The enemy was all around. It was brutal and deadly. We had to be careful not to kill our comrades. We were tired, but had to stay awake or be dead. Early in the morning, Frank went back to the CP to obtain more grenades as the squad had used them all. I have fought on Tulagi, Guadalcanal, and Iwo Jima, and I had not encountered a battle such as this one. The next morning, Corporal Guidone would be Sergeant Guidone. 2 companies of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, had been busy cleaning out the snipers in the western end of Tulagi. Captain Harry J. Connor's company, E, and Captain Charles R. Baker's company, F. Captain Harold T.A. Richmond's company, G, followed the raiders to the Government House area in the eastern end, where they reported to Colonel Edson. Meanwhile, the 3rd Platoon, Company H, 2/5, was ordered to relieve Company E. E had been ordered to move across to Gavutu to support the 1st Marine Parachute Battalion, which had been badly shot up. The securing of that island was then still in doubt. Before Company E could leave for Gavutu, however, the order was countermanded. PFC Howard Schnauber of Company E, 2nd Battalion, 11th Marines, was assigned to a 75mm pack howitzer unit attached to 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, for the invasion of Tulagi. It seems wherever 2/5 moved, so did 2/11. I went ashore in one of the older Eureka landing craft, the kind where you roll over the side instead of going out the bow. On the way in, we lost some men because of a light machine gun hidden in a small cave not too far from the landing site and to the left. A 75mm pack howitzer was a difficult piece of weaponry that was manhandled ashore piece by piece, then put together and pulled by a jeep. We got ashore and lugged the ammo. To reach the other side of the island where we were assigned, we had to move through the Tulagi Pass, a shortcut through the steep hill separating one side of the island from the other. The slot was level but contained 2 large caves, air raid shelters dug into the limestone, which housed quite a number of Japanese troops. The only way past them was for the foot Marines to shoot into the entrance while the jeep pulled the howitzer past. This system worked well, and we managed to get the gun to the opposite side. On the northwest side of Tulagi, the ground levelled out and slanted toward the beach. After we got all the equipment to our assigned area, it was decided to dismantle one howitzer and lug it up the steep slope of a large hill. The advantage of this location was a perfect spot for a view covering the water between the canal and Tulagi, a perfect field of fire. The 75mm shell traversed a lofty, curving trajectory with a range of about 6 miles. We all expected the Japanese to retaliate at any time, so our positions were set up as a defensive perimeter. My section had a machine gun with light and heavy, air-cooled .30 caliber guns and some air-cooled .50 caliber along with rifles and bars, Browning automatic rifle. By evening, everyone was alert and in place. Foxholes were dug, but we were on edge, not knowing what to expect. Some enemy began to move around in the dark. We knew it was the Japanese because our orders were explicit to stay put and stay awake. Sometime during the night, I heard a Marine call out Hollywood, and the answer came back, Rollipop. Then, Rollipop hell, and the next thing we heard was the sound of a .30 caliber machine gun filling the night air. Another artilleryman, Cyrus J. Jim Moore, E2-11, was pressed into service as a stevedore in the rush to get supplies ashore on D-Day. We were offloading equipment and supplies for our assault on Tulagi when we received word that the Japanese Navy was on the way and would arrive at our position soon. We began frantically loading everything we could into Higgins boats, and when they were filled to capacity, we started throwing food, which was stored in wooden containers, over the side, hoping it would float ashore and could be retrieved later. During this commotion, someone suggested that the possibility of having to use a gas mask on a small island was very unlikely. We proceeded to dump our gas mask paraphernalia and fill the bag with items we thought we'd need more, such as cigarettes, candy, and anything else we could think of. We moved to our designated area and set up our artillery pieces, 75mm pack howitzers, for support of the Marines still engaged. We then received word to pack up and move the weapons to overlook Tulagi Harbour. While we were manually moving the guns along the beach, a Japanese submarine appeared about a half-mile offshore and began shelling Marine positions on the island with its deck gun. Our CO ordered our forward observers to immediately go up a hill near the beach to return fire on the submarine. We set up our guns in record time and began firing at will. We saw some of our shells hit the submarine, and it was reported that we got 5 direct hits, sending it to the bottom. Whether the claim for the sinking is true or not, I couldn't say for certain, but I know we hit it a few times. The Japanese did not report the loss of any submarines that day. We continued relocating and had just settled ourselves for a much-needed rest after manually pulling the guns all the way from one end of the island to the other and setting them up again. Suddenly someone shouted, "Gas!" You can imagine how we felt after dumping our masks for other unnecessary items. We sat there, waiting for the end to come. It turned out the enemy had fired a couple of rounds filled with something that smelled like chlorine. Maybe they did, and maybe they didn't. Who knows? From that time on, whenever we were called up for invasions, we always had our gas masks, even if it meant no cigarettes or candy. Japanese commander Masaki Suzuki had concentrated his sea infantrymen on the steep slopes of Hill 281, around which his command post was deeply entrenched, protected by sandbags and supported by machine gun pits in the shovel-shaped ravine west of the hill and slightly north of King George Field. Several light machine guns covered the valley between the southeastern slope of Residency Hill and Hill 281. A heavy machine gun was emplaced to cover both Beach White and the southeastern slope of 281. While alone on the east end of King George Field, Pert El Speicher was hit by a sniper's bullet and was buried where he died. That evening, zealous banzai charges carried the Kure 3rd men straight into the muzzles of the American machine guns. Although they showed fanatical courage, each successive attack resulted in the further loss of what essentially was cannon fodder, making the next assault less potent. Other charges occurred that evening of 7 the 8th of August and the morning of the 8th. A belly full of sake possibly influenced these suicidal attacks, a technique that had previously proved effective when fighting the poorly armed Chinese. The cold steel charges, now called bamboo spear tactics, were a method the Japanese had perfected over the years. Experts analyzing the Japanese forces during the war in the Pacific theorized that they were an army of humans supported by machines of war, whereas for the United States, machines of war were supported by men. On that first day of the invasion, the corpsmen attached to the raiders became heroes in their own right. Not only did they risk their lives time and again to attend to the wounded, but they also dispatched some of the enemy. One especially brave and courageous pill-pusher was Harold P. McCann, who killed 4 Japanese with his .45 sidearm on D-Day. Apparently, the enemy had sighted McCann, who was wearing his Red Cross armband, and began shooting at him while he was administering aid to wounded raiders. Day 1 had seen a tough afternoon. The night, Major Chambers recalled, was even worse. The Japanese tried every trick on us that we had been told they would, yet that we really never imagined they would. They shouted, whistled, and sniped at us all night. In fact, you might say that they slept with us. At first, there was considerable promiscuous night firing, the Japanese trying to locate our units by shooting at us at random. But our men learned to hold their fire and not give away their position unless attacked in a hand-to-hand assault. During the night, the Kure 3rd Sea infantrymen conducted piercing attacks and counterattacks, succeeding in driving a sharp wedge between Raider Companies A and C, isolating Company C along the beach. They then turned on Company A in a vain attempt to attack up the ridge toward the British Residency, Edson's command post. In this mad assault, the Rikusentai failed. The Marines of Company A lost some good men in the skirmish, but they killed 26 Japanese within yards of the defense line, and the attack was thwarted. The Kure men made 5 determined attacks between 0300 and 0530 in the early morning hours of the 8th of August. Through constant pushing by small groups or individual probing attempts, they were able to infiltrate almost to Edson's command post. Dick Horton reported that the Japanese reached the command post at the Residency, and a half-dozen or so were killed under the building. He recalls, "My particular post was to be nearby Red Mike, Colonel Edson. The battle heated up from the afternoon of the landing until the Japanese had been driven down and off the island. The really noisy and exciting time was early the next morning when the Japanese attempted a counterattack. Henry Jocelyn, who had been with Raiders Company C, described how they were cut off during the night and had to form a defensive circle in and around a crater, into which the Japanese lobbed grenades. Despite this, the Marines held fast, and by morning found that they had killed a number of the enemy at minimal cost to themselves. The Japanese citizen, and therefore the Japanese soldier or sailor, was educated in devotion to his country and respect for his superiors to a degree that amazed Americans. Japanese drama and literature glorified war, while American films and literature often portrayed war as futile and tragic. Americans were seen as impatient and volatile, whereas the Japanese were patient and obedient. The image of the samurai bowman, who was expected to take his own life if he missed the target, was deeply ingrained in Japanese characters. Japanese strengths and weaknesses were summarized by an analyst in the 1930s. Rapidity of attack is a marked feature of all their training on land and sea, as well as in the air. Where rapid thinking is required to adapt to the unexpected, the Japanese probably fall short. Provided nothing disrupts their carefully thought-out plans, they have few equals and no superiors. According to SME Gichi Nohara, Kato Platoon, the Kure 3rd SNLF had practiced night ambush operations and trench warfare at the base of the anti-aircraft station. Attacks against the marine lines on Tulagi occurred between 0200 and 0500 on the 8th of August, but the Rikusentai did not have sufficient manpower or reinforcements to break through the American positions. Even if they had, there was no place to go. At 0300 that morning, Raider PFC Edward H. Ahrens of Company A was on the right flank of his battalion as part of the security detail when a Japanese officer, with 2 companions, attempted to infiltrate the American lines. Despite being shot and knifed several times, Ahrens helped repel the assault. After dawn, Captain Walt found him wounded and barely alive. Author Joseph H. Alexander wrote, "Ahrens managed to kill the Japanese lieutenant and the other a sergeant and several others. However, the only lieutenants on Tulagi were Spielant J. Kikichi Yoshimoto, the 54-year-old former detachment commander, Lieutenant Ryoichi Chadani, the doctor, and Lieutenant Ko Nomura, the supply officer. Ahrens could not have killed a sergeant because there was no such rank in the Imperial Navy. They were all sailors. Historian Samuel Eliot Morrison, in his History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, described them as non-seagoing sailors. On the 8th of August, the Marines secured a building and discovered a quantity of Japanese medical supplies, including medicines, linens, pans, and fine surgical instruments. PHM-2C Huey M. Whitey Love reported that Second Lieutenant Tiger Erskine, the Raiders' Japanese interpreter, translated the Japanese medicine labels and wrote the English names on each bottle. This became the basic medical supply for the Marines. Japanese quinine powder, with a very bitter taste, was soon put to use. Without gelatin capsules, it was mixed with water and administered to malaria patients, who had to be closely monitored to ensure they swallowed it. On the morning of the 8th, Companies E and F, 5th Marines, faced significant trouble at Hill 281. The aggressive Company C raiders eventually captured and controlled the hill, though their task remained to flush out the isolated Japanese hidden in every corner. From their key position, the Marine mortar and machine gun teams could apply effective firepower to any area of resistance. Later that day, Colonel Edson declared Tulagi secure, but he reconsidered as resistance continued from unexpected locations. In the evening of D+1, CPLL Robert B. Pape of the 1st Raider Battalion, Headquarters Company B, found himself under a house during a fight. To his surprise, 15 Japanese, some wounded, crawled in nearby to escape machine gun fire. Although they were unaware of his presence, Papa was eventually recognized, and the enemy opened fire, hitting him in the leg. Despite this, he managed to call for help. A nearby machine gun post responded, killing all the attackers. On day 2, the 1st Raider Battalion was tasked with cleaning up armed stragglers from the western part of Tulagi, while the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, was ordered to clear bypassed pockets on the eastern side. Companies E and F, which had engaged Japanese survivors on the western part, led the advance. From a line northeast of Hill 281, with F Company on the right and E on the left, the Marines cautiously moved southwest. Hill 281, heavily blasted, was honeycombed with hidden chambers where the enemy could hide. Some Japanese emplacements were destroyed, but the outnumbered defenders continued to fight. At 1300, Company G, 5th Marines, and the Raiders advanced on the last Japanese stronghold on Tulagi. E and F companies, moving along the north coast, trapped many Japanese between two prongs, the Raiders on one side and the 5th Marines on the other. The 81mm mortars of the 5th Marines pounded the enemy into submission, with the remaining Japanese almost annihilated. Despite this, the battle for Tulagi was not yet over. Many Kure men died in brutal hand-to-hand fighting during banzai charges. Marines also suffered losses. Chuck Barcombe, Wood Barr, Ken Bowers, Marion E. Bradley, Lou Carpalotti, Jerry Diovisalvo, Ben Fairbanks, Lieutenant Miles Fox, Joe Giffels, John Gilligan, Ed Guyot, Art Hampton, Julian Hanson, Frank Huber, Lieutenant Eugene M. Tex Key, Milton Lewis, Louis Art Lovin, Alexander Luke, Claude Miller, Francis Nee, Tom Nicol, Robert Payne, Bill Rainey, Bill Strandvold, Bill Trowbridge, and others died in the battle, some after General Rupertus had declared the island secure. Lieutenant J.G. Samuel S. Miles, USNR, was killed while attending the injured on the 7th of August, and Corpsman Ted Parker was nearly killed multiple times while aiding the wounded. PFC Clifford C. Red Hills of Company A won the praise and respect of Captain Lou Walt for his outstanding devotion to duty during the night attacks of 7-8 of August. Hills received the Navy Cross. On the day Lieutenant Key was killed, headquarters in Washington had promoted him to captain. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, had 24 casualties, with 8 killed in action, KIA, and 16 wounded. The 1st Raider Battalion suffered 99 casualties, including 39 KIA. On D+3, 3 badly wounded Raiders received a significant break. Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss and Privates Pike and John W. Hambrock were flown out of Tulagi Harbour on a PBY from VP-23, bound for hospitalization in the New Hebrides Islands. Gunny Goss, a demolition expert, was at least 10 to 12 years older than his fellow Raiders and was their senior NCO. His story is typical. Although wounded by a sniper from a cave, he charged the dugout, which was occupied by a handful of sailors, killing all of them. The Raiders were awarded 8 Navy Crosses, along with their share of Silver Stars and Purple Hearts. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, received a bucketful of Purple Heart medals. The only Bronze Star awarded for the Tulagi campaign was presented to Navy Corpsman PHM-2C John A. Gallagher of 1HQA. Lieutenant J.G. Samuel S. Miles, M.D., received a Silver Star posthumously. B.P. Wenver, with the New Nation magazine, wrote, "Daylight the next morning found us steaming along, and a short while after we anchored in Tulagi Harbour, only a few hundred yards from the land. And what a land it looked to us! The beauty of that early morning scene beggars description, and one had a feeling that God had especially endowed this earthly paradise with all beauty and glory." Toward the end of that second day, at 21:30 on the night of the 8th of August, while the light cruiser San Juan was navigating the waters adjacent to Tulagi Island, a deck spotter saw an SOS signal from a small light. The CL-54 maneuvered toward the glow to investigate, and found a Higgins boat. Moving alongside for a closer inspection, they discovered that the craft contained wounded raiders. Some kind saint had brought the injured from Tulagi out to the harbour seeking medical assistance. The men were taken on board the warship and cared for. At 10:56 on D-Day, the 7th of August, the Paramarines, another special unit of the Marine Corps skilled in parachute drop invasion, headed for Japanese-held Gavutu, codename Acidity, a 21-acre island, 250 by 500 yards in size. The 1st Parachute Battalion was comprised of 338 enlisted men, 23 officers, 30 naval personnel, 4 doctors, and a U.S. Navy chaplain. Also attached was an enlisted Marine, Patriot Robert M. Howard, the photographer from Headquarters Company, 1st Marine Division. His job was to take photos, not to kill the enemy. The omens for the Paramarines, however, were disconcerting. On the Haywood, one of the transports carrying them to Gavutu, a sergeant and a corporal were practicing knife fighting, and the corporal somehow sliced the sergeant's abdomen from hip bone to hip bone. The landing force would be short one non-commissioned officer. These Marines were assault troops sent to hit the small, tightly held island enclave, similar to the landing at Anza Cove at Gallipoli in 1915, but on a miniature scale. Whereas the Turks had held a controlling ridge at Gallipoli, the Japanese at Gavutu had a compact defensive position backed by the island's commanding hill, much to the Paramarines' disadvantage. A major handicap was the lack of up-to-date details on Gavutu's terrain. When Lieutenant Colonel Frank B. Gertger, the 1st Marine Division intelligence officer, travelled to Australia seeking data on the Solomons for the operation, he overlooked interviewing the 50-odd Australian commandos and aircrews who had served on Gavutu and Tanambogo for 8 months during 1941-42. These men, then serving in Australia or New Guinea, could have provided information not available elsewhere but were not contacted. Gertger and his staff should have combed Australia and New Guinea for information in general, but especially regarding Gavutu. However, Gertger had to work through General MacArthur's staff, which was a handicap from the start, and he was not a trained intelligence officer. The Paramarines were an elite group within an all-volunteer service that had received extensive parachute training but had never jumped in combat. They had excellent tactical instruction, and like the raiders were considered ideally suited for their task. Dubbed the Shoots, the men of the 1st Parachute Battalion were under the command of Major Robert H. Williams, a daring bulldog of a leader. Gavutu was to be the most difficult to crack of the three-island complex, and before day one was over, the Marine landing there would set new mortality rates. Someone from the Haywood, the 20-year-old former city of Baltimore, CA-68, which the Marines now called the Haywire, had scattered rose petals on the pathway to Gavutu, implying that this would be an easy show. Hit, run, leave the Japanese bodies where they fell, get out with your skin. The 1st Parachute Battalion, overconfident, was destined to wade into a hornet's nest. Its entire mission as a component of Operation Watchtower had been jinxed since the men had left San Francisco on the 22nd of June. The government had chartered a commercial ship, the John Ericsson, to move them from the west coast to Wellington, New Zealand, to join the 1st Marine Division for the upcoming operation. The voyage was a disaster from beginning to end. The beat-up vessel's refrigeration broke down after 7 days at sea, causing all the fresh food to spoil and be thrown overboard. The Marines aboard survived on meagre hardtack and sardines. By the time they reached New Zealand, they were starving and exhausted. Most had lost 20 pounds. Shortly after the Ericsson docked at Wellington's Pipitea Wharf, the unpatriotic New Zealand longshoremen, prone to strikes, were again engaged in a work stoppage. The wearied Paramarines, with no dockside assistance, were forced to unload their miserable ship and then combat load the Haywood in drizzling rain. They finally shoved off for the Koro Islands, Fiji Islands, to participate in the pre-invasion practice landing, which was another unanticipated failure. The paratroops were slated to invade Gavutu as infantry, with the landing scheduled for H+4 hours or 1200. When exiting the Haywood, the Shoots had disembarked into 13 blunt-nose LCPs, painted grey to give the appearance of steel, with a few shallow-draft Higgins Eureka boats mixed in. Major Williams would comment, "This battalion was unique in that in reality it was the old breed. All sergeants and many corporals who were on their second 4-year enlistment. Some of the staff NCOs had 8 or 10 years of service, and thus an attitude of professionalism had characterized the battalion. The Gavutu Hill, Miwa Hill, Hill 148, named after the commander of the unit on the hill, Split Lieutenant J.G. Toshichi Mitsuwa, and nearby Tanambogo were honeycombed with dugout strongholds that had sheltered most of the Japanese during the bombardments. Since the dawn attack on the Twin Islands air complex, the now grounded Japanese airmen on Tanambogo had a limited number of weapons readily available, other than a handful of Nambu 8mm pistols and 32 old 1905.38 caliber rifles. However, the maintenance shop contained several 20mm and 13mm machine guns and 7.7mm light Nambu weapons in various stages of repair. The ordnance men worked feverishly to make these guns operable, cannibalizing other weapons to prepare them in case the Allied forces ventured onto Tanambogo. They fully expected that the Japanese Navy would come to their rescue before the day was out. Surrender was absolutely unacceptable. The Gavutu Tanambogo invasion plan, set forth in Operations Order No. 5, revised, of the 4th of August 1942, was clear and simple. Under Plan R, the 1st Parachute Battalion was to attack Gavutu, seize the island, and then attack and capture Tanambogo. They were to defend these islands until relieved. Under Plan T, elements of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, after seizing Macambo, were to be prepared to send one reinforced company to relieve the forces on Gavutu and Tanambogo. However, this was never executed as the Japanese kept them busy on Tulagi. The Paramarines at Gavutu were equipped with a few JLMGs, Johnson light machine guns, called the Johnny gun, and, if in sufficient supply, the Rising folding stock submachine gun. The JLMG was the weapon of choice, but there were not enough for all the troops. The Rising, called a grease gun, was a disappointment due to chronic jamming problems caused by rust residue from the salt water and the island climate. The gun was plagued by constant malfunctions. In the initial jungle fighting, it was effective at only 150 yards, putting the chutes at a disadvantage even before the first shot was fired. The Paramarines had received stateside parachute training in securing an enemy-dominated position by jumping from an air transport. But this training was of no value in their initial combat operation, as they headed for one of Hell's Islands in boats. The leadership had been lax in assessing the deployment and led the Paramarines to believe the operation would be effortless. This misguided assessment of Gavutu led to a nonchalant attitude, which placed the chutes directly into a hotbed of lethal firepower. The primary error lay not with the Paramarines' combat management, but with the U.S. Navy, which should have assigned a few cruiser big guns to pound Gavutu and Tanambogo. Although the big gun warship attack on Guadalcanal did little harm, it played a role. Had this attention been applied to Gavutu and Tanambogo, it might not have produced a walk in the sun for the Paramarines, but at least it wouldn't have been a ride into hell. The 7-mile journey from the Haywood began late morning on the 7th of August. The chutes were delayed in taking off because they had to wait until Edson's raiders, who had landed on Beach Blue Tulagi, released the landing craft for the Paramarines' use. The first wave, Company A, shoved off at 10:56. It was followed 5 minutes later by Companies B and C. The passage had an ominous beginning. The sea was anything but calm, and the chutes were jolted around in the rocky landing craft like corks in stormy waters. The bouncing Higgins boats and constant spray of seawater drenched them. Their carefully cleaned weapons packs and assorted assault gear were soaked, their eyes stung, and most were seasick. While the parachutists were inbound, the San Juan pumped more than 800 rounds of armor-piercing into Gavutu within 30 minutes. One Marine watching that day later said, "I didn't see how the Japanese could live through all that shelling." But San Juan's pounding did little damage to the defenders, who were holed up in caves and beach dugouts. The armor-piercing shells were ineffective in this staged bombardment. Major Robert H. Williams, the CO, was in the lead craft and stood next to Lieutenant Richard E. Benink, USNR, the landing craft commander. Williams was anxious to get underway and urged Benink ahead. Under pressure, the lieutenant reluctantly gave an early go signal, and the San Juan's last salvo landed in the water just ahead. Furious, Lieutenant Benink cursed the major. "Damn it! I am in command until we hit the beach, and don't ever do that again." Unfortunately, the naval gunfire was lifted too soon, and the Japanese were quickly able to reorganize and marshal their forces to greet the invaders. Their reception for the shoots was machine gun fire. The defenders of Gavutu had been expecting the American troops for hours, watching the landing craft every step of the way. Gavutu was essentially just over a handful of acres, and the Japanese could shift men and automatic weapons to any threatened sector in minutes. Once they knew where the Marines would land, they concentrated their firepower on that location. Due to sharp coral clusters bordering most of the island, the initial landing was made on the northeastern side, not too distant from the causeway connecting the island with Tanambogo. As a result, the landing craft had to pass along the eastern part of the island, between it and Cape Hororo on Florida Island, and then make a sharp left toward the proposed landing area. The Monson and the destroyer Buchanan had been firing at Gavutu and lifted fire only a few minutes before the shoots landed. However, from the wreckage of a downed Emily flying boat in Gavutu's harbour came scattered machine gun fire as the landing boats passed, a menace that was not corrected until the following day by a platoon under Sergeant Warren Fitch, Elaho's 3 halves. Compounding the landing problems, some coxswains were so frightened that they dropped their passengers far from the beach, forcing paramarines to wade through a barrage of bullets. The preceding shelling caused additional problems. "These boats intended to land at the concrete seaplane ramps," said General Vandergrift, but because the heavy naval gunfire and bombing preparation had tumbled huge blocks of cement in the path of the leading waves, several of the boats were forced to land along the concrete dock to the right. Had the chutes landed on the ramp, it would have provided a running start for them, and the outcome might have been different. One coxswain, lanky Larry Michaels, who stood 6 feet 4 inches, brought his landing craft right up to Gavutu's gateway for the dubious honour of being the first to arrive at hell's doorstep. Being so tall, Michaels made an ideal target for Japanese snipers, but somehow they missed him. However, they did hit his boat's machine gunner in the shin. 20-year-old seaman John P. Lanigan recalled, "In going in, I was lying down on the side of the gunwale next to my Lewis gun, and I could hear Larry singing a hymn and a Marine sergeant telling me where he wanted me to direct my fire. When we hit the beach, all hell broke loose. This Marine radio operator fell just as he got up and over the ramp, and I went to assist him to his feet, and I think that's when I caught it. I thought I bumped my shin on the gunwale, but Larry said I was bleeding. After pulling away from the slaughter, Larry took me to the hospital ship." The chutes landed on Gavutu promptly at 1200 on day 1, right on schedule. The first wave, with Company A, beached at 3 selected landing points, about 25 yards apart. The Japanese defenders allowed the Allied forces to land with relative ease, and some soldiers stumbled ashore almost too seasick to care about the situation. Captain Kermit Mason was struck by a Japanese bullet even before he landed. Lieutenant Benink reported losing 1 boat to a hand grenade and 2 men, with overall casualties amounting to 1 man out of every 10 that landed. The first man ashore was First Lieutenant Norman R. Nickerson, commander of the 2nd Platoon, Company A. Major Williams, the gallant leader of the 1st Parachute Battalion, was also among the first, but he quickly disappeared from sight. He slowed down only when he was struck by a bullet. Nickerson recalled, "I saw Williams fall and rushed to his aid with my platoon, where we formed a protective shield around the major until a corpsman arrived. 4 boats transporting Parachute Company C landed to the right of Lever's Wharf. Each landing craft was equipped with 2 Lewis guns, left over from World War I and of questionable utility, good for only 97 to 100 rounds before becoming ineffective. The chutes carried Riesing submachine guns, 60mm mortars, a few Johnson rifles, .45 caliber Colts for the officers, and a few stray pistols bearing the markings of the U.S. Army Smith & Wessons. The first wave had 3 Bangalore torpedoes, 1 on each Higgins boat, but only 1 made it to the beach. Japanese Lieutenant Mitsuwa, the crafty Gavutu gun commander, had fortified the commanding hill with automatic weapons. His 54 gunners were primarily responsible for holding back the Paramarines, supported by the civilian labourers of the Hashimoto Construction Force, led by Shinya Hashimoto with 132 men, and the Hara Construction Force, led by Inore Hara with 50 men, as well as 11 airmen from the Avgas unit of the Yokohama Air Group floatplane fighter unit, based at Halavo, Florida Island, and 1 casual air officer. A total of 248 Japanese were present on D-Day. They allowed the first wave to land, and when the Americans were within range, the order came, "Hasha o hajime! Commence firing!" This took a heavy toll on the Leathernecks as they beached or waded through deep, murky water. Mitsuwa's unit spent more than its share of time on Nambu machine guns and used them effectively. Although the Marines thought the marksmanship of the defenders was poor, the Japanese inflicted a significant toll. Mitsuwa's gunners maintained a steady stream of fire as the Paramarines cautiously advanced on the left flank. Fortunately for the chutes, the anti-aircraft gun on Miwa Hill could not be lowered. Otherwise, the situation would have been even more dire. Since the dawn attack on the Twin Islands air complex, the Japanese aircraft crews and service personnel had managed to obtain some machine guns from the repair shop on Tanambogo that had been urgently made operational. Defending their base, the airmen joined the fray, pouring fire on the advancing Marines. MCPO Masaichiro Miyagawa of the Yokohama Air Group Flying Boat Unit reported, "Unfortunately, there was no strong resistance set up at the landing sector, and some Marines managed to get to shore. Yet the 1st Parachute Battalion still had no major beachhead. The second wave of Paramarines landed a minute and a half later, facing heavy gunfire. 3 were hit before they even left the boat, and others were hit as they splashed toward shore. As the Higgins boats were pulling away, one was hit and sunk by a well-placed hand grenade thrown from shore, killing 2 sailors. On Tanambogo, 21-year-old S.A. Jinsaku Sakurai of the Yokohama Air Group was sleeping on a cot beneath the quarters of the medical officer, Lieutenant Commander Mankichi Hoshino. Hoshino's quarters were in a building on stilts near the water's edge, a typical spacious and breezy native construction allowing one to walk underneath. On the morning of August 7th, Sakurai was startled awake by an unfamiliar shrill sound. Upon jumping up, he saw an aircraft with American markings flying so low that he could distinguish the goggles on the pilots. As Sakurai ran for cover, he grabbed a tin case and began banging on it while yelling, "Teki no Kyushu! Enemy raid!" The planes were coming in from the west over Florida Island, flying low through the morning mist. Sakurai joined 6 officers, Lieutenant Commander Tashio, Lieutenant Tadao Shima the accountant, and 4 ensigns, who quickly headed for the officers' shelter. 10 minutes later, a flight of Grumman fighters appeared, bombing and strafing in successive waves. Sakurai could see that the waters around Tulagi were full of warships moving about while shelling Tanambogo. The attack continued for 2 hours. Unable to stay in the officers' shelter, Sakurai ran out during breaks in the barrage, lying flat when shells exploded and running again before the next salvo. Eventually, he reached a large shelter on the opposite side of the small island, where he was momentarily safe. The assignment for the chutes from Captain William McKennan's Company A, 1st Parachute Battalion, was to secure the landing area and provide a protected haven. This was accomplished under intensely difficult conditions. The Gavutu defenders were armed with the Arisaka Model 38 weapon, whose high-velocity nickel-iron bullet packed a powerful punch at distances under 300 yards. In skilled hands, this weapon inflicted heavy casualties on the landing units. The second wave, Company B, which landed to the left of Company A in a rock pile area, faced brutal fire while still on board the Higgins boats. The third wave, Company C, also encountered fire from Gavutu's Hill 148 and 152 from Hill 121 on Tanambogo, but landed in the beach sector behind Company A. They were even subjected to machine gun fire from the offshore islet Guyomi called Dead Man's Island. Captain Richard J. Heworth of Company C was killed while going over the gunwale, and others nearby were also struck. Shortly after, Heworth's young friend, Second Lieutenant Walter W. Kaiser, was hit, ending a promising career. One landing craft was lost, and several crewmen were killed. Corporal Crescenzo P. DeMattis was on Gavutu soil less than 10 minutes before being killed by a sniper's bullet. While the Shoots were engaged in the lethal fields of Gavutu, the U.S. Navy was occupied with the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Force, IJNAF, on the waters surrounding Guadalcanal. The Shoots on shore could hear the aerial battle but could not see it. They had their own troubles, staying alive. One of the battle hazards on Gavutu was an anti-tank gun built into a concrete bunker, a weapon that would cause significant problems before the day was over. The bunker had been constructed by members of the Tanaka Butai during their brief stay on Gavutu, and the builders had left their anti-tank weapon there when they were transferred to Guadalcanal. A much smaller pest on the island was the red ants, swarming on Gavutu soil in the millions. The crawling Shoots had them on their hands and fingers, on their faces, in their ears, and down their backs, all the while confronting the constant deadly Japanese cannonade. Typical of their commitment was PFC Warren L. Givens, a Lewis gun operator on his Higgins boat, who poured fire at the enemy. He never ducked to safety, and continued to shoot in the face of intense opposition. When his gun jammed, Givens grabbed the closest rifle and kept firing until he was hit. He later died of the wound. When the third wave of 140 men landed at 12:06, some of the craft were forced to pull back 1,000 yards because of the murderous weapons fire. Those who landed faced brutal firepower, and several Shoots were hit while still aboard their craft. Ian's Galen Craig Brown, USNR, the third wave landing commander, managed to beach at about 1,300. He found a platoon of paramarines held up by heavy fire behind the protection of the smashed concrete debris along Lever's dock. When the 1st Parachute Battalion finally gained a foothold, it was confined to a small area on the tiny island, and the defenders concentrated their firepower on that sector. The paramarines had fire coming from all directions and could solve only one problem at a time. The first one was Gavutu's Hill. Lawrence Moran of Company B recalled, "We left the Haywood around 1,000 and circled her for about 2 hours. I got seasick from all the bouncing around. We, the second wave, landed about midday, not on the beach, but on a concrete ramp at about a 45-degree angle. I had a hell of a time getting out. The Japanese were not zeroing in on our boat, or I would have been a goner. My entire magazine went into the drink. Our company was supposed to go through Company A and take the hill, but it didn't quite happen that way. I stopped off and was left behind by the others who headed for that pesky hill to see where the other Japanese were located. What I saw was a sandbag fortification at the other end of the causeway with a machine gun, and this weapon was shooting at our guys trying to take the hill. Some paramarines from Company A managed to toss a grenade at a cave entrance and killed 2 of the 3 enemy, but I imagine some were still alive. This was adjacent to the risky hill and a fortified position. The entrance was slightly plugged by sandbags. I could not see too much because of that small entrance just seeping light and dust. I told the guys with machine guns, who set up weapons about 20 yards from the entrance, that I saw some enemies still alive. Arriving on the scene about this time was this second Luli with a Riesing gun who set his gun on full automatic and, perhaps playing the Hollywood part, started blasting at the sandbag emplacement. From the emplacement came a single shot. It seemed loud to me because I was so close. Then I heard that a lieutenant, Walter X. Young, was shot through the neck. That was real and not Hollywood style, because in Hollywood the victims don't bleed real blood. About this time I realized I had to get going to catch up with my platoon now charging up the hill. As I started up the incline, 2 dive bombers started to drop bombs, and they exploded near the top of the hill, yet the Japanese flag was still flying. That cured me from moving to the top, so I just went halfway up the hill to protect myself from the wild carrier pilots. When I came down, the sandbag emplacement was on fire, and the bags were peppered with holes, so the sand was pouring out. I guess the 2 Japanese were in there. We finally took the hill at a terrific cost of lives. We buried our dead and were relieved by the 2nd Marines. Company A attempted to neutralize the deadly hill from a different angle. Plat Sergeant Thomas P. Driscoll was killed at 14:30 while attempting to dislodge the defenders. Shortly afterward, Plat Sergeant Ronald F. Kaczynski, also from Company A, was killed while leading his 3rd platoon. The parachutists were encountering heavy concentrated fire from Tanambogo, where the Japanese airmen from the flying boat detachment were supporting Hill 148 from their side of the causeway. Another adversary, this one unintended, was a U.S. Navy dive bomber. While flying over Gavutu, its gunner opened fire at the paramarines below. They madly waved at him, but he kept on shooting. On his 2nd trip around, the Leathernecks fired back, and the Dauntless finally flew off. Reportedly, the gunner killed at least 2 Americans. Pursuit Leo M. Gagnon, 2nd Platoon, Company A, grappled with some Japanese in a hand-to-hand struggle, and though outnumbered, he managed to kill one of them. When another man threw a grenade at him, Gagnon quickly retrieved it and tossed it back, silencing the thrower. But the gallant Marine was then killed by one of the defenders. PFC Theodore J. Howell, also in the 2nd Platoon, had a different experience with the Japanese. After hours of fighting, he finally reached the heavily defended Hill 148 when someone set off the ammo dump nearby and sent Hoole flying. The next thing he remembers was that he was on board the Neville. Pursuit William J. Taylor, Jr., HQ-1, earned the title Wild Bill, as he was all over the island. According to one ex-paramarine, Taylor never remained still. In contrast, one officer, Miller, was dubbed Foxhole because he found an empty pit and directed his platoon from his stationary headquarters with orders to "Get 'em, boys!" The parachutists were trained to fight as individuals, and PFC Robert G. Fuller of Company C from Newburyport, Massachusetts, did just that. Fuller was a one-man hurricane. He attacked a fortified machine gun emplacement against withering blasts from the enemy, and in perilous hand-to-hand combat killed 8 of Mitsua's men. Another standout was Sea Palal Ralph W. Fordyce of Company A, one of the first to beach and one of the first in action. While inland, Fordyce overpowered an enemy Navy man, and taking his gun, shot and killed his opponent and another enemy soldier. Then he daringly attacked a machine gun emplacement, killing all 5 defenders. CPL Carmen C. Delia single-handedly attacked another fortified position, fighting until he neutralized the enemy post. In that action, Delia took a Japanese slug in the shoulder. He was taken to the Gavutu makeshift hospital, the former Lever's store, and later evacuated to New Zealand. In yet another daring assault, Sergeant Wilfred V. Michaud killed 8 of the enemy, eliminating a hazardous obstacle and thus helping clear the way for the Marines' advance. The U.S. Navy doctors, Lieutenant Harold Schwartz and Lieutenant Harry Eisenberg, had their hands full patching up these casualties as best they could and sending them off to the better organized shipboard medical facilities in the harbour. The Neville was declared the hospital vessel for the casualties, but some wounded paramarines ended up on the Unholy Four, the name given to the other transports. With Major Williams down, Major Charles A. Miller, Colorado of Company B, succeeded to command of the battalion. Williams's runner was unable to contact Miller for 30 minutes, however, which complicated the leadership problem, as Miller's command post had not yet been established. The battle raged on Gavutu without leadership. Miller was in a vacuum. Captain George R. Stallings, the commander of the weapons unit, played an important role in securing the island by reducing the Japanese strongpoints with the proper placement of his 60mm mortars. Meanwhile, Lieutenant William C. Ellis, USNR, the third wave commander, was instructed to transfer the wounded to the Neville in one of the damaged boats. However, while his Higgins boat was withdrawing, 2 of the crew were wounded. During this period, Japanese small arms fire from both Tanambogo and Gavutu became so intense that each of the sailors who were boating the wounded back to safety wondered if any of those flying slugs had his name on it. By 1400, on the 7th of August, the chutes on the left flank had made suitable progress and were able to apply constant mortar fire on the right flank. Lieutenant Gregory's platoon was tied down as they attempted to reach Miller's command post to provide protection. The command post was also the short-term hospital, temporarily set up in Lever's store. It was a 2-story structure, one of the largest buildings on the island, but was subject to intense sniper fire. Eventually, however, the exhausted paramarines established some minor control over Gavutu. Company A of the 1st Parachute Battalion had a number of exceptional men, among them PFC George F. Grady. Grady was having difficulty with his Riesing gun, but nevertheless, he rushed 3 of the enemy who were firing on his squad and engaged them in hand-to-hand combat. He killed 2 before he was mortally wounded. He died 5 hours after landing. Some remnants of Company B, under Captain Richard S. Johnson, finally managed to subdue the Gavutu Hill, but they suffered losses for their bravery. Marine gunner Robert L. Manning of Company B, 1st Parachute Battalion, heroically charged the hill and bolted through Hell's Islands, the key entrance, then engaged several of the enemy in a hand-to-hand struggle that resulted in the death of Lieutenant Mitsuwa. Finally, the Stars and Stripes were raised over Gavutu, possibly to inform the U.S. Navy flyers that the island was now United States territory. But at that moment, the rising sun still flew over Tanambogo. Day 1 at Gavutu, from morning to night, is relived in 2 more individual accounts. Leonard Kiesel of Company C, 1st Parachute Battalion, was part of the 3rd wave. Breakfast, the 7th of August, 1 apple. What a way to go to battle. That morning we were all lined up on the railing of the Haywood, watching the Navy planes strafe the 2 target islands, Gavutu and Tanambogo. I remember seeing a Japanese gas and oil storage unit go up in smoke, the result of shooting and bombing by our Navy. We were all anxious and excited, but had to wait our turn to board the Higgins boats, as they were committed to the first raiders for the Tulagi landing. We were called upon to make the Gavutu landing at 1200. When we finally climbed down the rope net into the barges, the water had turned a bit rough. The barges were bouncing up and down, and when I attempted to drop off the net into a waiting Higgins, my knees were almost driven up to my shoulder blades. Brief distress, but nothing like I would feel later on. The U.S. Navy started shelling and blasting the shoreline. Their shells were streaking over our heads. We were on our way in, finally. As we came closer to Gavutu, one of our coxswains was hit and instantly killed. His assistant took over and hunched down in the bottom of the barge, steering by reaching his hand up to the wheel. About 50 yards offshore, he uttered, "This is as far as I go, boys." We had to bail over the sides. No landing ramps on these old plywood babies. Over we went, chest deep in water, bullets singing by, some hitting the water. It was so concentrated at one time, I considered ducking under the water and going in that way. 2 of our mortar men, with mortars strapped on their backs, stepped into deep holes in the coral and never did come up. Another chute, Pursuit Lawton R. Crumpler, Jr., C1, just in front of me, stumbled and went down. I thought he had slipped. After catching him by the shoulders, I dropped him instantly. Half his face was gone. All this happened in a few seconds. Finally, getting to move along a little, now up to my belt line, then knee-deep and beginning to move better, when, wham, I am knocked off my feet. Getting up, I tried to run, but my right leg buckled under me. It was then I knew I was hit. I managed to crawl up to the beach and headed to my left and got behind a piece of concrete, from the blasted seaplane ramp, to shelter me from the gun that hit me. I called corpsmen, but none came. I applied a tourniquet to my leg to stop the bleeding. Every time I moved to change my tourniquet, the Japanese would pepper my area. I finally made up my mind that this was my area to defend and set things up accordingly. A knife stuck in the ground near my head, 2 grenades nearby, and my piece by my side. Looking over the top of the concrete slab, I noticed 3 enemies about 70 yards away, along the beach in a downed Japanese seaplane, or what was left of one. They were busy manning the one gun that was operating. I quickly took aim and fired 3 shots. I know I killed one of them and wounded the other. Now I waited. No more firing from that pest hole. Thank God. Next, I heard a dragging or crawling sound coming in my direction. I reached for my rifle, but he was quickly upon me, swinging a knife. Instead, I got him. I felt exhausted. For some reason it was quiet. I began to get a little scared. I heard muffled sounds and put my ear to the ground and could hear Japanese voices around me. The sounds seemed to be coming from the ground itself. I guess there were tunnels everywhere. My legs still hurt badly, and I was almost immobile. After 3 hours, I decided to give a corpsman another call. To my surprise, 2 corpsmen appeared almost at once. I was taken up to a makeshift hospital, a partially damaged galvanized building high on a hill on Gavutu. Sulphur powder was applied to my leg, which was then stretched out and bound. Later that night, 2 Higgins boats were called in to evacuate the wounded, including myself. We were placed in metal mesh stretchers and loaded on board for a trip to the Neville, which served as a hospital vessel. As they were hoisting the stretcher to the deck, I was in the lower basket being raised up with 1 stretcher above me. The Marine in the stretcher above me had been hit in the lung area and was bleeding badly. His basket was full of blood. As it neared the deck, his stretcher partially tipped, causing his blood to splash on me. When I reached the deck, I heard a medic call out, "Get this guy over to the operating room right away." I said, "This is not my blood. I was hit in the leg. That guy," pointing my finger. "He is the one you want." Likewise, the events of that day remained etched in the mind of ex-paratrooper Robert Walter Moore of the 3rd Platoon, Company B, 50 years after the battle. On August 7th, my platoon was together on the deck of the Higgins boat heading into Gavutu. We were informed that there were about 600 Japanese and some labourers. We asked how to distinguish who was who and were told, "You can't just kill them all." As we approached the cement dock, Lever's Pier, Marine gunner Robert Manning, MG, looked over the bow of the landing craft and said, "There couldn't possibly be anyone alive there." It had been blasted and shelled from one end to the other, and the island was absolutely bare except for a few coconut trees that seemed to have survived. As we were approaching the seawall and dock, about 75 yards out, we hit a coral reef. The bow of the boat swung to the left and was lowered. We all ploughed into the water, not realizing it was up to our necks. We started heading for the seawall, with bullets whizzing around us and heavy fire hitting the water, accompanied by the sound of shells flying by. After a vexing time, we reached the seawall. There were cement blocks about 3x3. My platoon assembled at the base of the seawall and commenced firing, except for me. My weapon would not fire. I tried everything I knew to get it to operate, but to no avail. Weaponless, with the enemy firing at the Marines, including me, Manning tried to fix my weapon with no success. Finally, he said, "Throw the damn thing away," and handed me his .45 pistol, a Colt A1 Source weapon. He still had a workable Riesing submachine gun and said, "Follow me and stay close." Believe me, I did. We finally managed to crawl up the seawall and land. It was slow going as we headed east to the base of Hill 148, facing murderous fire from there. We attempted to make ourselves as small a target as possible, struggling all the way, and finally managed to reach the base of the hill. There was a small wash running from the base to the water. It was there that I saw my first dead Marine, CPL, Harold E. Johns, who was a rigger in Headquarters Company. I have never forgotten it. We continued up the east side of the hill under extreme fire. It was very slow going, with casualties all along the route. The hill was approximately 140 feet high, with caves and dugouts all the way up. The first Japanese soldiers I saw in one of the dugouts were big men in grey uniforms from the Mitsuwa AA gun unit. William K. Vesey, B1, was in the Japanese dugout, swearing and stabbing any enemy within bayonet distance repeatedly with his bayonet. I saw Platoon Sergeant Howard D. Pumroy, B1, and Second Lieutenant Walter W. Kaiser, who had been killed. The two were close friends, possibly from the same town. There was constant machine gun fire coming from a tin roof building, Lever's store. We were pinned down for some time. I don't recall how long. We had not yet reached our goal. One of two planes, an SBD, dropped a bomb at the top of the hill, killing some of our own people and inflicting injuries on others. Somehow we finally reached the top and wiped out the machine gun nest. That night we dug in as best we could on the side of the hill. It rained buckets, and we lay in our foxhole, alert but soaked and shivering. At about 2200 there was a rumbling, and the upper part of a battle-scarred coconut tree came crashing down in our area, killing CPL, Joseph G. Breezing, B1. Joe had gone through the day without a scratch, only to be killed by a falling tree. The next morning I received Joe's Reesing gun and returned Manning's .45. Colonel W.J. McKennan later wrote, "As commander of A Company, I was convinced by nightfall of D-Day that the combined small unit tactics of both A and B companies had overcome all organized resistance on Hill 148, and Gavutu was indeed secure." But the battle had not ended, only subsided. The Paramarines' mission was to seize Gavutu and then attack and secure Tanambogo. The plan was to commit Company C to overrun the opposition airmen, though they didn't know they were airmen at the time, and seize Tanambogo, utilizing the remainder of the shot-up shoot battalion to grab the island via the causeway. A systematic destruction of enemy trouble spots began on D+1 using TNT, gasoline and dynamite. Captain Harry L. Torgerson, HQ Wone, a demolition expert, became well known for his part in blowing up the caves on Gavutu, blasting the Japanese to Kingdom Come or sealing the caves shut. Torgerson adhered to the cockroach theory: uncover one and there are likely to be more. However, the majority of Japanese cave holdouts were terrified labourers from the construction units. While the exhausted chutes commanders began working out a plan to invade the twin island, the Yokohama airmen planted drums of gasoline across the portal to block the passageway between Gavutu and Tanambogo, hoping against hope that the Imperial Navy would rescue them before the Marines broke through the barriers. Lieutenant Sida Saburo Katsuda, the air group's executive officer, planned the operation involving the gasoline drums. He was certain the Americans would not make a landing before nightfall. A coral reef extended through the waters adjoining the officers' dugout, and since the invaders' landing craft would hit the bottom and be stranded, they probably would not approach there. Katsuda believed the landing would be either at the wharf or by the causeway. When the air attacks subsided, he organized a large group of airmen to move a quantity of 200-litre gasoline drums from the wharf and place them along the water's edge and across the portal to block the passageway between Gavutu and Tanambogo. Some drums were placed near the radio shack. That evening, between 2200 and 2300, just as Katsuda had predicted, enemy assault craft cut their engines and began attempting to land. But his plan had defects, and eventually it would cause more harm to his Tanambogo defenders. Smoke and flames from the burning gasoline would block the machine gunners' view, allowing the Marines to rush in. The constant fire coming from Tanambogo prevented the Marines from crossing the causeway and was taxing the push-pull energies of the tired chutes. One of the aggravating spots was the island's water tower, where snipers took shots at the invaders until the nest was cleaned up. The Japanese airmen on Tanambogo had whittled away at the chutes, killing some and wounding others. The Paramarines commander had planned to employ the depleted Company C in an attempt to secure the dangerous passage across the causeway, but only about 70 worn-out Paramarines were available for the thrust. A strong supporting force was required to impel the drive across the stone walkway, and a message was sent out seeking reinforcements. Earlier, having completed its mission on Florida Island, Company B, 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, was ordered to return to the President Jackson for reassignment. The ship's captain sent 6 boats to retrieve Captain Edward Crane's troopers at 1500, but while en route they were intercepted by Major William K. Enright, the executive officer of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. Enright issued verbal orders to Crane to land on Gavutu and transfer control of his company to the commanding officer of the 1st Parachute Battalion, Major Charles A. Miller, who had replaced the wounded Major Williams. However, Miller was often away, and Captain George R. Stallings became the part-time CO. Company B was now to shift to Gavutu in a supporting role. The difficulty was that Captain Crane was informed that only a small pocket of snipers held the island. Actually, there were about 240 Japanese air unit personnel. 3 of Captain Crane's Higgins boats were ordered to proceed to the northeastern portion of Tanambogo to attack the defenders from the rear. The others headed in another direction. 1 boat containing the 2nd platoon got hung up on a coral reef and took no part in the assault. In the meantime, the destroyers began shelling the wharves and the jetty on Tanambogo's eastern shore. Crane had anticipated a landing at about 1845 under the cover of darkness, but this cover was blown when one of the last shells fired, a wild one, hit Gavutu's fuel dump. The Marines were silhouetted in the glare of the burning oil, becoming a shooting gallery for the enemy shore guns. Bedlam prevailed, with Company B's LCPs going in all directions, some out of control and some headed for the shore. A couple of leathernecks were killed while manning the Lewis guns on one bow, and a coxswain in another craft was also killed. A few landing craft crashed onto the beach area near the docks, and as they tried to approach, the heavy fire drove the Marines back to their boats. 2 boats were wrecked, and the wounded ended up in the water. Some swam back to Florida Island. The Japanese managed to perforate one of the boats, causing 6 casualties. The bonfire on shore clearly outlined Captain Crane's Marines before they all had an opportunity to fully disembark, resulting in many casualties. A machine gun unit, 4th Platoon, Company D, managed to reach shore and set up 2 of its weapons on Lever's Dock, but came under heavy gunfire and was forced to withdraw. The Japanese took advantage of the situation, having a duck shoot. Coxswain John S. Evans, USNR, who had taken Crane's troops to Florida early that morning, was now involved in boating some Company B Marines to Gavutu. At high risk, he managed to disembark passengers from his LCP, including CPL George F. Goodspeed Jr., CPL William S. Parks, and PFC Everett J. Rogers, who somehow obtained a foothold on the rock. Evans and his crew remained at Gavutu until 0400 on D+1, with the LCP serving as an aid station. They were under constant fire as casualties were loaded, but Evans successfully withdrew and delivered the wounded to the Neville. He then took his landing craft back into the Maelstrom, transporting more 2nd Marines from the Jackson to Gavutu in support of the beleaguered 1st Parachute Battalion, according to Chief Pharmacist's mate William F. Graham. After we had been shot out of the Higgins boats, it was Captain Crane who gathered us together and led us back to Gavutu, wading chin-deep in water along the causeway. In the darkness, both Japanese and the Marines on Gavutu were firing at us. The coolness displayed by Captain Crane held us together. Some men from Company B who did manage to land took cover wherever they could, with even Gavutu's scrub brush providing some shelter. Crane's determination and the stalwart remnants of Company B who managed to get to shore established a toehold. His problem was not so much the Japanese, but the para-Marines who were trigger-happy and unaware that a number of unannounced 2nd Marines were in their midst. Crane shouted, "I'm Captain Edgar Crane, Company B, 2nd Marines," but was mistaken for an enemy due to his southwestern drawl. Torgerson intervened, calling out, "Hold your fire, I know this guy." Captain Crane's Gavutu landing cost the 2nd Marines 8 dead, 14 wounded, and 26 missing. Among the survivors, Elmer R. Wetzel of Company D, 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, and his companions who had supported the landing spent a miserable night in the chilly water, hugging the pilings of Lever's Pier to avoid enemy fire. Wetzel, cold, hungry, and tired, hung on for dear life in the 20-fathom deep water. Early the following morning, the remnants of Companies B and D were able to leave their cover and fight their way inland to join the battle. Miyagawa reported losses on Tanambogo for the 7th of August of only 10 air service personnel KIA, with approximately 250 still alive. The uncertain struggle would continue.